Welcome to our session on the future of work. So tonight, I'm pleased to welcome Ben, Ben Koslowski, who's a research lead at Fletcher Priest. He's an architect trained designer and with a PhD in communication design from the Royal College of Art. And he focuses on developing innovative approaches to respond to design challenges at various scales, from urban design to architecture and interiors. And he, in the practice, supports a number of the innovation initiatives. He's joined by Sam Ki, who joined Fletcher Priest in 2016 and has worked on a number of workplace projects, in particular, a few in the city that he might be able to talk to us about later on. And Chris Radley, who's an associate who's been with Fletcher Priest since 2011 and also has an expertise in workplace in particular, but also in leisure and hospitality at various stages from design to construction. And he's been working with this initiative. The three of them have been working on this initiative together. And so today, I'll invite you to start maybe by taking through this piece, which explores the evolving workplace and how and where will we work in the near future. And then perhaps we can all have a discussion following your presentation.
Great. Well, thank you for the introduction, Hala. Good evening, everyone. So we will be presenting FutureWork, our animated entry for the BCO's Next Gen Design Competition. This was submitted in the autumn. We had 10 minutes then to present in the competition, but we'll be expanding on it a little bit this evening. So FutureWork is a short animation that looks at the places where we work and rethinks the workplace as a network of connected places. It discusses remote working and how workplaces might evolve, with key underlying themes of health, sustainability, and experience. This piece of work grew from conversations we've had across the practice and with the people we work with about the likely impact of the coronavirus pandemic and the widespread move to remote work over the course of the last year. We speculated about where things might be going and what lasting changes there might be because of the pandemic. This developed from Fletcher Priest's projects across multiple scales, designing places where people live and work. These inform each other and have been a springboard for our research. We thought an animation might be a good format to share and discuss our thinking whilst we're all working remotely, and to spark a wider debate about the challenges we're facing. Our entry for the BCO's competition was the animation itself. However, this was supported by an evolving graphic novel which contains the data and insights we based the piece on. The challenge for us really was to look beyond the pandemic to ask questions about how buildings can better support people and their health, and also do the right thing for the environment. At the beginning of 2020, the Australian wildfires were all over the news, and initially we were worried that suddenly the climate emergency was being overshadowed by the pandemic. So for us, this animation was less about pinning down specifics and much more about having a discussion with people we work with. And it was developed more as a prompt and provocation. The animation itself is about 4 minutes long. There is some sound, so please turn up the volume a little bit. And we should be able to share a link afterwards if there are any issues with people's connection speeds. So after the animation, we'll go through some of the ideas in a bit more detail, and hopefully via the Q&A, we can all have a bit of a discussion.
quieter than usual after an extraordinary intervention which will affect everyone's daily life.
Hope you've all enjoyed the video. We are now going to further elaborate a couple of key scenes and the ideas embedded in the piece that you've just saw. This is an image of how the animation is made using a technique called parallax, where depth is created on a camera path across a 2D artwork. We worked with our colleague in the CGI team, Dave Hughes, to develop this piece that you have just seen. As you can tell from the drawing style, it is intentionally to be kept quite loose and graphical with a sense of a graphic novel. As Ben, Chris, and I consider this not a design proposal, but a prompt for discussion about the ingredients that will make future workplace better. And also how we might value and measure the workplace performance beyond only pound per square foot. For example, can things like a good view, fresh air, high quality amenity space becomes more dominant factor when evaluating and designing a building? We have had a lot of discussion about how we can move away from just looking at area on a 2D floor plans. We know from our own experience that volume of space can have a significant impact on letting. despite the volume quality, the volume quality being less straightforward to be quantified. We've seen this at our Brunel building on the Paddington Basin that has achieved a record rents for the area. We also know that the internal volume is essential to offer flexibility to how the building to how the building can be used and adapted in the future environment. We see a very strong sustainability argument to strike for a resilient and adaptive building design. Another thing that we picked up in the animation is to consider every single part of our working day as a total experience, but not just the time that you spend at the office. If we think about the workplace in a broader sense, maybe people won't dislike the commute so much if it becomes more pleasant and productive to allow them to work on the go.
Right, and one of the things that's really struck us is that the longer the lockdowns and the pandemic seem to go on, the more we're actually beginning to value perhaps the role of the workplace that brings us together. In a way, perhaps it's been a bit of an ad for the office over the past year. And that, you know, people like Cal Newport talked about this already last year, but it's perhaps much more about the sort of human qualities of being together, and that it's normal for us to do this. And Kirsten Saylor from the Bartlett School of Architecture also talked about this really nicely in an article where she was really talking about the weak-tie interactions that have really suffered so much during the pandemic. Again, it's that being together and sharing experience that's so fundamental to both our own sort of sanity, but also organizational well-being. And it also seems to us that learning is a really key aspect that's really hard to replicate when we're remote and online. And especially younger people entering the workforce. And we've actually had colleagues who we've not even met in person yet, who've joined over the past year. It's really hard to bring those people on board and to kind of, you know, allow them to kind of share in an organizational sort of culture, perhaps. And the other thing that's really struck us that's really important is the role that in the years to come, artificial intelligence and automation will begin to play. And McKinsey estimates that about 45% of work activities broadly overall could be automated, but actually in financial services that's also 40%, which you know, we believe will have quite a big impact on the nature of work and the role that the workplace will have to play within this. And we've heard from some people who say they're really glad they'll never have to go back to the office. And apart from worrying a bit what their office and their sort of workplace environment might be like if they're glad to never go back to it, we actually, you know, we wonder that might work quite well if your job is stable or sort of somewhat static. But that becomes very different when your role and the nature of your work begins to evolve. And we've all heard of the kind of experience-led workplaces and the role that experience is playing increasingly. And that's not just a thing over the past year, but we think that it's really important that to enable that learning and exchange. And we expect that the shared workplaces will have to work much harder in bringing people together. And perhaps it's also a useful starting point to just not call them offices anymore. And going forward, they'll have to offer something that you can't get at home or in your local co-working hub, for example, if that's where you might choose to work. So we'll need much better tech infrastructure to facilitate remote and blended working. We'll need social space and space for leisure, but also space for things outside of work. And we'll need better space for bringing people together and encourage collaboration. And perhaps in some way, workplaces might just return back to the sort of much cited London coffee house, which fundamentally was about exchange of information and knowledge. Another thing that the animation touches on is that buildings and the organizations that occupy them might more actively need to support art and culture and to make sure that city centres hold on to the things that really make them interesting, special, and the place that we want to go to. So as a provocation, we're suggesting that there might be a space with a screen that can be a cinema, but it can also be a space for a lecture or a corporate event during the day. There's the art gallery again, which is actually a super flexible space, the white box. And then there's a yoga class happening, as well as the idea of a tennis court or the climbing wall. And we're not really saying that all of these things have to, that buildings have to accommodate all of these things. But we're really keen to not just think about buildings as individual assets, but to instead think about what they bring to a wider neighbourhood, and to think about how a group of buildings can offer these amenities that can be shared between building occupants as well as the general public or the passerby. Again, we've had lots of discussion about how that might work financially, and not that there's a solution or a particular view on that, but for example, the question of whether this might be more about developing a better sort of set of memberships to a portfolio of properties rather than the traditional tenancy in a single building. And we've also had interesting views on whether the hospitality sector that suffered so much over the past year might be able to step in here, because they're really good at creating welcoming shared spaces. So alongside creating more engaging experiences, this is also about making best use of buildings throughout the day and the week. And again, we're interested in thinking about this when we think about going to a 4-day week at some point in the future, like some Scandinavian countries, for example, are exploring. And that's about resourcefulness in terms of best use of space that we build, but also resourcefulness in terms of the environment, and really moving away from building buildings that are empty 2/3 of the time or even more. So here you can see the base of the building from the animation, where you see a marketplace, integrated end of journey facilities on the right, and an open reception area without a sort of corporate lobby and speed lanes that quite often are a bit more of a line of defense rather than your warm welcome you might want to see when you go to the central office or workplace. And the point is really that workplaces need to be much better neighbours that perhaps are more permeable and contribute to their neighbourhood. And the result of that might be a richer mix that makes the whole city centre as a workplace a more engaging destination. And we're looking at this on a range of our current projects. This is 55 Gracechurch Street, which was recommended for approval by the City of London Planning Committee only a few weeks ago. And this project has a multi-storey exchange zone with public routes through and a mix of uses from cafes to retail and incubator workspace and a public garden that are for the benefits of the neighbourhood, not just people who occupy floors above. And one of the interesting things that's come up in our discussions we've had so far that quite surprised us is a discussion about how we can think about what work is more holistically, not just think about this in terms of white-collar work, but really think about it in terms of all users and the people that operate within the city. And in the city centre, that's really about considering the journeys of all the users. Whether they're delivering a parcel or whether they're your CEO who's biking into a building via a loading bay. And it's about breaking down the traditional barriers, or the traditional distinctions between a sort of back of house and a front of house, as you can see in this image. So we're increasingly exploring that sort of more blurred and open and flexible ground play.
It has been fascinating for us to see how the tone of our conversation has shifted over the last few months. For example, the question of whether people would prefer working in satellite offices near their home came up quite frequently. As you can see on the screen, the idea of integrating workplace within the high street has been explored. Upper floor of the high street can become small offices, co-working spaces that can be used by locals as their remote office to provide alternative future workplace that have the right facility and at the right location. This was talked about a lot, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic last spring. However, we are yet to see evidence about this happening on a bigger scale, and perhaps it is unlikely that companies will increase their risk by taking on more real estate. But this model may be applied more to smaller urban centers outside of London, for example. Apart from the potential of local high streets, we also see emerging opportunities to repurpose other spaces across the cities, such as railway arches as shown on the screen.
So lastly, what has emerged for us over the past year is that the challenges we're dealing with at the moment are really quite closely interlinked. So as Chris has already said at the beginning, while at the beginning of last year, we were dealing with Australian wildfires and the climate emergency was really top of the list. And then we really began to focus on the health emergency. But actually, these are really closely interrelated. And in a way, we need to address one by looking at, or we need to address them all in conjunction. And workplaces really have to do the right thing for the environment on the one side by reusing and extending buildings, as we showed in the animation, to limit carbon impact. But they also have to do the right thing for everyone using them. And that's about providing light and fresh air and access to nature and a variety of work settings essentially to choose from. Here you can see our project at 135 Bishopsgate, which is a refurbishment of a building. It's a building with really good bones. And once you strip out the raised access floors, and especially the trading floors, and you remove the suspended ceilings, you actually get incredible volume within this that makes it a much more flexible and adaptable space. And we're actually quite optimistic about the fact that doing the right thing in terms of health and the environment are really becoming commercial imperatives, and that increasing funding is tied up with green credentials, for example, and in a way that's the way to push this into the right direction. And then one thing we've learned in our discussions with agents, for example, over the past year or past few months, is that the expectation baseline really has shifted quite fundamentally over the past year. We've heard lots about things being accelerating and change happening fast and all of that, but what really resonated with us was this notion of this expectation baseline, where now prospective occupiers simply expect buildings to have the right green credentials, and things such as excellent end-of-journey facilities are much more important now that more and more people are taking up cycling, again, perhaps spurred on a bit by the pandemic.
So to conclude our presentation, this slide shows people who have the freedom and choice to work in Wi-Fi enabled crop circles. And we think a big part of the challenge with this whole debate is that we think it's maybe too early to make really meaningful predictions when we're still in and out of lockdowns. The working from home experiment isn't really an experiment when there are restrictions on our choice of working in a way that suits each of our own individual needs and preferences. We think the future landscape of work will be more about flexibility and making those choices within a network of connected workplaces. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe can you stop sharing so people can see your faces better. Thank you very much. I must say the images were really beautiful, and you touch on a number of concepts. So before I take questions from the audience, let me ask you a few questions and this raised with me. So in the context of the emerging concepts around the 15-minute city and the creation of a series of local hubs, which then contain everything that our everyday urban life needs to reduce commutes and so on, but also creating hubs that are complementary, so a city remains a city for the what do you think, how do you see a hybrid model emerge which has these local hubs that you talked about, and in combination with working from the office rather than from home? So do you think we'll see work from home sort of slowly disappear and be replaced by these local hubs that then become part of a hybrid model with the maybe more traditional workplace?
I think it's a really good question, the question of whether work from home will disappear and whether that will almost be replaced by people choosing a different location, still perhaps closer to home. I think what strikes me about the kind of 15 city model is that in a way most cities were 15-minute cities. Most cities always have been 15-minute cities and have sort of, in a sense, only through transport engineering and traffic engineering, in particular through the car, have sort of actually really shifted away from being that. So in many ways, sort of structurally, you might not actually begin to see that much of a change, because ultimately our local hubs have always catered for a local life, whether you're in a London borough in Zone 2 or in a local high street in Zone 2 or 3. In a way, there's all the facilities that can support local life. And you probably in a few years' time, you might walk down the street and you might not really notice much of a difference. I think that it's almost more the question of how people manage their own space and their own time, and that fundamentally maybe doesn't really impact the way we that alone doesn't impact the way that we put a building together necessarily, or how that works. I think on the home working front, I think again that'll actually be about individual choice. And the really difficult thing at the moment is it's so hard to speculate about what people choose to do when actually we don't have a choice yet. We're working from home. That's it, like it or not. And I think some people find that it works very well for the individual life circumstances, and that's great. And I think hopefully we can hold on culturally to allowing people to manage people in a way where they can work from home if they need to. And it doesn't really matter if they, if it's a washing machine delivery or if it's childcare obligations or whatever else it might be, because ultimately we know they'll get their job done. And we've proven that over the past year. So I think that sort of shift is as much about choice as it is about management and that kind of cultural, organizational culture that enables people to work in that way. And I think lots of organizations hopefully will stick with that. I'm sure there'll be some organizations that will snap back into almost the queen bee syndrome of trying to get people into one space where you can monitor what they do. But hopefully in a way that, what we've been forced to do over the past year has moved us away from that.
Thanks, Ben. I don't know, Chris, would you want to add, do you have anything to add, or should I move on to my next
Yeah, I think probably earlier on last year, there was a lot of talk about the hub and spoke model for some organizations. And I think my own opinion is that might work for some really big organizations that can afford to have their sort of satellite offices almost. But I think from a kind of personal point of view, just kind of echoing what Ben said, really, that's, I think what would be really great is having somewhere local that you could go to for an afternoon or a day, just to sort of focus on a task, say, outside of your home environment, without having to commit to going into the center of a city to do that. I think trying to keep an office culture going when you're basically dispersing that culture amongst smaller elements is probably harder than sort of trying to keep it all together in one place, I think. But I think there's probably different solutions for different organizations and buildings and setups.
Thank you. Then my next question is with regards to land use. So there's a lot of interesting play on overlapping of uses within the same building, and as you know, in the case of London, it's, some things are quite fixed. How do you see us overcoming that challenge?
It's a point that we brought up in a couple of our discussions, and we had a discussion with a developer who works a lot in the city, and what they were actually saying is that managing land users has always been their expertise. They've always been really good, and they pride themselves in creating places by managing. We brought it up through the question of, does your use class E have a big impact on those sort of questions? And actually they were saying that actually they're not really that fussed about use class E, because for them, working in inner city, in the city of London, they actually know exactly how to play that game and how to manipulate that and how to work within the constraints. And perhaps that that use class E is perhaps much more relevant in discussions about repurposing the high street or repurposing local town centres that perhaps need to have slightly more fundamental shifts as a result of lots of places closing down and things like that. But actually, to them, actually, what was interesting to us is that it seemed almost, that's just their bread and butter anyway.
And so you mentioned the high street, and obviously, like, one of the big questions we're all asking is changes to retail and hospitality. And at the beginning of your presentation, you touch a little bit on the topic. Are you able to tell us a little bit more, maybe using some examples of the projects currently in the practice, how you're thinking of, I think this question connects to also so how you're programming and thinking of ground floors in your master plans or in your office buildings, but as well as part of the discussion on creating, you talked about creating communities, and so what thoughts are you giving to social infrastructure, but also to the changes in retail?
Yeah, I think it's probably a pretty well-known fact that there's predictions of 20 to 30% of oversupply of retail space at the moment, and I think we are engaged in a few projects looking at how that could be repurposed for other uses. I think a lot of the time these are sort of shopping center environments that are designed on a mono-use perspective, and I think if you can sort of reposition those to be more of a mixture of different business types, not national chains that you see in the same high street across the country, but maybe more sort of local businesses, and maybe going from businesses that sell objects to businesses that sell services, and they might actually want more of a physical presence rather than being kind of online or hidden away in a large multi-tenanted office building. So I think it's a really interesting area for development. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Ben?
Well, just the thing that strikes me actually going through the City of London at the moment, for example, is that there's still so many buildings that are being completed at the moment, or that have recently been completed, where you cycle past and it's just a massive 3-story corporate lobby clad in marble and things like that. And that's a brand new space, and somehow that actually just feels like a quite sort of alien environment. It almost feels like a sort of beast from another time, from another era. And then we're working several projects where it's much more about integrating cafe facilities and other uses into your entrance into a building, which sort of the next step along. But actually, I think it is that question of permeability and, in a sense, blurring the edges. And goes back to your question, Hala, about the kind of how you manage the overlap of uses. But part of the challenge is that actually they still need to become, we need that flexibility. For yes, it might be a cafe one day, that's part of your reception experience. It might be a branded retail experience the next day that really taps much more into this sort of experience economy that everyone's talking about. But I think that's still quite an evolving discussion, and actually very different thinking about a London city centre location where you have real critical mass to do something really exciting and interesting. That is quite a different debate when you then go out to, in London zones 2 or 3, or then if you look at other towns, for example, that just don't have that critical mass in the city centre. So partly, I think, and that, that's why it was interesting in the conversations we've had with people that, so many people are actually hoping that, people will just want to go back to the city centre to bring that activity. Because we see it at the moment in central London, it's just, without a daytime working population, there is no critical mass to actually deliver any of these shared uses and these shared amenities. Another facet to that conversation is perhaps the mix between uses, more broadly between, how many people actually live in places. And I think that's, again, sort of, a difficult debate in London, I think, is, what we've seen now is that, there's sort of districts that are really suffering from not having a daytime population it's sort of product of a long period of evolution, but ultimately really makes it quite hard for those areas to operate on that sort of, as you mentioned, that 15-minute model, for example. And I guess you question the sustainability a little bit of those places that are so monocultural, perhaps. And I think it's interesting, places like, I think the City of London are working really hard on bringing much more culture in. And again, it's sort of that comparison between a West End destination versus city destination, and who that attracts as a tenant. In the West End, you already have a different mix of uses that draws people in a different way, that then attracts occupiers in a different way. And I think, that's another thing to look at, that kind of cultural question, not just retail as a destination point.
Thank you, Ben. I think I'd like to ask a lot of questions about the graphics, because I thought the system that you developed, it was very compelling. I leave these questions, unless you want to say something about it before I move on to questions from the audience. All right, I'll move on to questions from the audience. So the first one is, how connected are you with the Build Back Better campaign for green new jobs? And following on that one is, how much focus is there on getting net zero, and what is the time scale for that? That's from Catherine.
So, I mean, we're not directly connected with the Build Back Better campaign. I mean, I am sort of aware of its principles, which I think are more using the response to the pandemic to increase social equality and stimulate an economy based more on sustainable technology jobs. I think that's their aim, and I think yeah, I think personally I would support all of that. I think the economics of sustainability were always there before the pandemic, and I think, yeah, as we said during the presentation, we think there's a massive overlap between the responses to the climate crisis and the responses to the coronavirus pandemic. So from that sense, I think as building designs develop to meet these challenges, I'm sure that will stimulate the economy in that sector.
And then there's a question around getting to net zero, and I think that's super interesting, because that conversation is just accelerating so much. And I think Catherine's question around what is the timescale for that is it's such a good question, because we've got a sort of government timeline, and the UK being the first government globally to commit in law to a timeline for that. 2050 is our target, but actually it's now big corporates who are setting their own targets for this that are much more ambitious than that. And at the beginning of last year, just before the pandemic really got to Europe, Amazon and Microsoft and all of those organizations, for example, were almost sort of falling over themselves to try and make their big announcement about their net zero commitments. And I think one organization said 2040, and then Microsoft came out and said actually 2030. Plus, looking not just at their own organization, but actually looking at the whole supply chain. And I think we at the moment we sort of feel that actually that's the thing that will really drive the direction. And in a way, it's almost the legislation that sort of catching up with that, was on a slightly perhaps more evenly paced timescale. And I think the pressures from big organizations down to their supply chains will be really huge, and will impact so many organizations that occupy all of these buildings we're talking about all across London, for example, who might not sign up to this themselves, but are basically committed to it by the people they're working with. And hopefully that will just really drive the change there, and drive those targets. And from I think a year ago, I don't think that many people were talking about ESG. And still there's some people say, what is ESG? But all of a sudden, every environmental social governance is in everyone's mouths. And again, it seems to be partly the fact that even in particular, investment is so tied up with making sure that it's made into long-term viable assets, and the gas guzzlers are just not viewed as secure enough anymore, which again is great to fundamentally drive that change.
Thank you. There's another question from Janet. It's I'd say maybe more about engagement and community engagement. So how can these important issues be discussed and debated during planning, when the narrative for some of them comes from professional developers, architects, engineers, and local communities who might be not professional? That's what I'm reading. And Janet's experience is that the divide between residents and commercial developers remains as strong as ever. So as a practice, are you changing, for example, the way you were engaging with communities, even before planning stages, maybe at visioning stages? Are you developing tools or methods that address this divide?
Yes, I think on the first part of the question about communicating some of the issues to non-professional neighbours of developments, I think especially around sustainability, there's been a huge increase in the knowledge within the professional industry, I think, over the last few years. And that's very often very technical knowledge. And I think the key thing for us has been to translate that into things that non-technical people could understand. So, for example, the embodied carbon question, not many people can visualize what 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide is, but if you say it's the equivalent of flying to New York 100 times, or quite a popular way of doing it is converting it into cars being taken off the road, for example, something that people can relate to. Yeah, I think, but I think one thing I've noticed over the last 2 or 3 years is an awful lot of our projects are switching more towards refurbishments rather than new build projects, which obviously has a massive sustainability benefits, and also I think are generally less controversial than demolition and a new build.
Yeah, I guess part of that's about disruption to your neighbours. But I think the question of community engagement is really important to us, especially because we're working across urban design and master planning and architecture. And a lot of the project is really about actually developing quite long-term relationships with local communities, where ultimately the only way of, for example, thinking about some of our master planning projects, we're working in a large site at Waterbeach in Cambridgeshire. And in a way, the only way to work there is to actually bring the community on board from day one and to be really open about what's actually going to happen, but also to articulate, how that actually can really benefit people locally. And that is, a really big part of that is the provision of amenities, and whether that's new schools and whether that's improving transport infrastructure and things like that. That's or leisure facilities. And alongside all the work opportunities and other things that might come with development, but to be very transparent about what it in a way means to people individually, and to be open about that. And I think again the kind of the question I think for looking at the city centre again is the question about what do you actually bring to the neighbourhood. So rather than just developing your plot in isolation as a sort of vertical extrusion, really to think about actually what it is that does contribute more. And I think there's still a lot to do, quite frankly, and that's not we're really keen to be part of that conversation, pushing that forward.
Thank you. There's a question from Jim on Gracechurch Street, and it's first of all, they'd welcome a visit when possible, and then how did the company respond when the idea and the concept were first proposed?
You might have to wait a few years. So it's only just through planning, but hopefully in a few years time, we'd love to take you, but also you'll be able to go yourself, because the public garden will be publicly accessible, as is the whole exchange zone. So we don't have the project architects here with us now, so we don't want to speak too much on their behalf in terms of the overall design process. But I think a key thing with this project actually was to unlock what is actually quite a congested city block in a really congested area. And anyone who's been to the eastern cluster, the city cluster, knows how busy it is there, in particular around peak times, how congested pavements are. Most of the space is just given over to vehicles in the road. Hopefully that will change a bit. But a key part of that project actually is to open up routes through the site and to make the city block permeable. And one of the things we looked at was the history of the site, and the city's history of alleys and courtyards, and actually reinstating the historic routes through the site is really a key starting point to think about that. And then to make sure that those streets are open, permeable, and active throughout day and night. And then, from there on, you begin to lift things, because it's a quite constrained site, you begin to lift things up from the ground plane as well to make sure that you maintain that permeability. And that's really the starting point. And again, the conversation about what do you add to the wider neighborhood in terms of permeability, in terms of your new garden area that's open and accessible to all, and any of the mixed uses that come into the building.
Thanks, Ben. So another question first question from David. How much do you think a shift in what the workplace will depend on how commercial value is ascribed to workplace building, and how quickly do you expect commercial expectations to change?
I think the workplaces will have to change to maintain their value as buildings. I think I can imagine a year ago there was quite a lot of unease amongst office developers about what might happen in the future. But I think some of the ideas that we showed in the presentation show that the buildings can change to meet these demands, and I think the buildings that do change will probably become more valuable. I would speculate. As to how quickly, I think as well over the next coming months, I would imagine. I don't think once we sort of once we get onto this roadmap of exiting our series of lockdowns, I think the discussions over rent rebates and all those things that have been going on behind the scenes that we're not really involved in too much as architects, but I can imagine they will sharply come to a focus. And if people don't feel their building is what they want anymore, I'm sure the developer's going to have to change their offering.
And some expectations have changed already. So that was really interesting in one of our conversations with an agent we've worked with in the past, who's basically said that they're not even looking at buildings that don't have the right cycle facilities anymore. It's just not, they don't even bother at this point, and actually look for. And I think that's quite interesting. I mean, that might be just sort of one facet, but that has changed already.
Yeah, I think it's also about the fact that actually those changes has already been happening before the pandemic, and the pandemic is just an opportunity or sort of a trigger to accelerate things and accelerate the change, to basically accelerate this whole change that has already been happening to a faster pace, so that we are getting to those goals that we already set for ourselves for sort of a quicker time schedule.
And the other thing that we talked about within the practice over the past year is that quite a lot of these sort of ideas, and some of the ideas we touch on in the animation, are things we've been talking about for years, but they always get value engineered out because they're not viewed as bringing enough tangible value. And I think that's, again, the kind of great thing about the kind of commercial imperative changing quite rapidly now and catching up, is that actually quite a lot of the things that we really like about making more engaging places actually now sort of withstand the VE process.
Thank you. Now I have a question from Robin. As the office becomes more fragmented with more breakout spaces for different types of activities and cultured spaces, how do you think companies will be able to embed the culture of their companies on their staff, with their staff being so fragmented in so many different places of work? So how do you maintain company culture if you are working on a variety of satellite spaces and hybrid model?
I think that depends on the company probably, but I would imagine that one of the reasons people are going to want to go back to their main office, for example, is for the social interaction, which is what generates the culture in a business. I think I'm sure everyone's realised that it's quite difficult to do that over video calls, and I think what certainly myself and I imagine most people crave is a social interaction with their colleagues, which is why you would go into the office, I would imagine. So yeah, I think probably in terms of a fit out of an office, it will change from the proportion of, say, desk-based to sort of more informal working and meeting areas. But I think that's probably going to increase the sort of workplace culture within a business, I would suggest.
Yeah, I think it's exactly that question around how the kind of tasks change, and in a way, you might not go to the office anymore to just deal with your emails because you can do that at home. But actually, when you go to the office, it increases your chances of also bumping into someone that perhaps you're not even working with, or you're not working in the same division or on a project together, or whatever it might be. And so I get, in a sense, it's even about knowing the people in your organization and what interests them in a much more it's a sort of a much used term, but I guess that sort of notion of serendipity and actually being able to just encounter other people, in particular when you can't really plan for that encounter. We can organize a Teams meeting when we know who we want to talk to, and who we might need to work with, and we can organize ourselves on desks of banks around teams that are working together, for example. But actually, it's almost all the people that might be a bit peripheral to the work you need to get done right now that are probably the really important sort of connectors to build organizational culture. Again, it depends on the scale of the organization, of course. But I think the other thing is also, I think we're keen not to just think about this in terms of organizations internally, but actually organizations that work alongside each other. And I guess we've always seen a sort of clustering of like-minded businesses, whether that's agencies doing anything to do with the internet in Clerkenwell before the dot-com bubble burst, or then a similar thing happening around tech and Silicon Roundabout, or historic interest clusters in the city of London. Such good examples of legal clusters in the finance and things like that. There's always a natural grouping together, and I think creating these, providing the sort of amenity and the kind of all these other kind of spaces within buildings to be used by all is actually a really important part of building sort of inter-organizational culture, perhaps.
Thank you. Sam, I saw you unmuted yourself. Do you want to add?
Yeah, just want to add a couple of points further to Ben and Chris's answers. I think probably also an idea that we talked about quite often is the office building or a workplace in the future becoming more like an destination. So you don't go to the office only because of you want to go there and work, because you can do it like at home, but then it's more like building this sort of a destination, or say a temple for different company that brings out their own character, that actually enforce the uniqueness of the community within the company itself. So which is something that the building in the future could potentially work harder to actually make every single workplace of different company to have their own character, that becomes a destination for their staff to go to there, not only because of work, but because of they want to be part of the the office's culture and part of the community as well.
Thank you, Sam. And I am conscious of time, and so maybe I'll let you, Ben, Chris, and Sam, if you have any comments, closing remarks, anything you'd like to add.
I've actually just got a point to build on the last point. I think Robin's a really good question. It's perhaps the question is not so much about how we can maintain to build culture and things like that, but actually has perhaps the way we've been working so far been a real hindrance to working in the way that we want, to working in a way that perhaps suits us, to work in a way that sort of reflects any kind of idea of character and personality in a way. And I think the sort of idea of a sort of really regimented workplace, perhaps, you know, maybe this is now the moment where hopefully we can sort of consign that to history a little bit. But I think it goes back to that challenge around how the nature of our work just probably will evolve quite fundamentally in the next couple of decades. You know, one thing that we just hear over and over is that, you know, whether you're in a creative profession or not, the nature of work will become more creative, and that just requires these sort of different kind of spaces to support it, which actually is really exciting. I think that's a great thing for us, and that's a great thing for us as architects. That's a great landscape for us as architects to be working within. And I think also the challenges finally becoming more sort of imperative around health and the environment, again, is actually a great opportunity for us as architects to just create much more engaging places that, you know, just last longer.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation and the discussion. I hope the audience felt the same, and I look forward to seeing you all in person very soon.